I'm so happy and honored to meet you. Yeah, it is.
I'm
It is
so
such a nice surprise, right?
it's a fantastic surprise. Actually, it's great. I couldn't be more thrilled. There's just something special. So you're doing your doctorate, is that right?
Yes, I am doing my doctorate at Temple. This is hopefully, in theory and hopefully practically, my last semester. I'm trying to figure out with Dr. Abramovic the logistics of the whole thing and timeline. When to defend it, when to play the recital, and yeah. So part of the way I have thought about the work, about the dissertation, because I don't want it to be just another one about George Crumb, which, by the way, I was so surprised to see that many of them have been written, that they exist, about
Oh,
the
that's
music.
interesting. I don't think I knew that. I wondered about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I was so surprised too. I mean, I went just online. I didn't even have to go to Penn University library just to look there, or Temple. Just online, I could find a lot of them. Going back in the 70, no, not 70, after that, 80s, 90s. So yeah, a lot of them have been written about George Crumb. Not so many in the last 2, 3, even 4 years, from what I could see.
Yeah.
Not
I
so many.
sometimes when I was going to say if a composer sometimes after they die, sometimes if there's been a lot before, it drops off, I think. I think
Yes.
that's yeah. He's a jewel though. I mean, but so are you playing and then talking at the
Yes,
same time?
exactly. That's so part of the way I thought about it was not to just give information that anyone can find out from different dissertations or articles or interviews, because he's done a lot of those, but to actually offer my input as a player, because I am a performer, first of all, right? And then, no, but I did my lecture recital last year on Macro 1, and now I want to focus on Macro 2. And just write about Macro 2. Of course, I have to reference Macro 1. It's impossible not to. And then in the end, play Macro 2 in the graduation recital and Suite by Enescu. Just these two composers I want to pair. I think it's
Oh,
just,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
It's very
actually a
personal
nest.
in a way.
Yeah,
It's very personal. I
yeah.
wanted to make it personal. Although I have to say, I have found it to be a little bit challenging in terms of angle of approaching, because there are so many angles you can approach this music from, but then you go into a lot of rabbit holes, and there's not enough time. There's not,
Yeah.
my topic of conversation. Like, for example, I was thinking of addressing the rhetoric triangle, like logos, like the score, the written symbol, notes, and then ethos, composer's intentions, and what he wrote on the page in terms of character, and then the pathos, what the audience can perceive. But then Dr. A was like, okay, I understand your life philosophy, I understand your thing, but that's not your major, right? This is a very dangerous
Yeah.
minefield, in a way.
Yeah, because you end up like spending like years researching it. But the thing is, you
Yeah,
just need to get what you need to get the doctorate, and you
yeah,
can continue
yeah.
this study even after.
Of course,
It's hard though because you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is the last chance I have to really study this. But you spend the rest of your life studying. Quite
that's
honestly,
true. Absolutely, that's true. And just for the purpose of it, I could see that other monographs were not that expensive, like in terms of didn't have like 500 or 600 pages, but they were quite you know restrained. Just
right?
prove people to people that you can write about music as well as playing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Right. That's it.
but
So,
it's
do you have a
so
connection
interesting.
with Nescu? Is that you
I
said a
I'm
Nescu?
I'm I'm from Romania.
Ah,
I saw
so do
that
you
you
know?
post. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say I judged the Nescu
I know.
competition
I
this
saw
year.
that. I saw that. I saw that you posted the pictures from the Athenaeum at the gala. I
Yeah,
saw that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's a specialist down at University of Delaware who is a pianist who is from Romania.
Oh,
Yeah, I just blanked on her name. I'm so sorry. My
no,
brain
no, no.
just.
It's fine. Don't worry about it. I mean, I know other Romanian musicians, but
I'll get the name for you. She does a lot of accompanying. I don't know if she's on the faculty. Your husband is on the faculty. He's the viola teacher down there, and it's oh boy, I can't believe I can't
I
remember
can
this.
look her up. I mean, we are actually playing in Delaware, not at the university. We're playing this Sunday in Delaware. So, okay.
It's Angela, and I'm blanking on her last name, but I think it's only because I've been writing for like 6 hours today, so my
Okay.
brain is kind
I can look her up on the
yeah.
website of the
And
faculty.
I'll send you an email too.
Sure,
I'll
that would
send
be
you.
interesting to, to.
She did some definitive study, I think, for a doctorate on Enescu, and I think it's like it was something really unusual. But when I was there actually judging, she happened to be there. She did a concert with some of my pieces and a bunch of other works, but her family lives there. Yeah, it's an amazing country. I didn't get to see much of it, but I was
Yeah.
impressed.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, if you wanna take some time, like 2-3 weeks, and just go visit some spots, not necessarily south, but more north, and then
Yeah.
northwest, even center in Transylvania. Of course, there are so many iconic places.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish something for me and for Hugh as well, to just have more time to go there, to spend time there, and money, of course, and to
Yeah.
because you need that, just to see places that they must be seen. Like, for example, Brâncuși, there are some sculptures in Romania that are exhibited, and anyone can go see there for free. And I have
Wow.
never had the chance or the time, or I would say interest, unfortunately, my own shame, to go there. And now I'm so far away, and I'm like, yeah, I want to go there and see that.
I understand.
That's because I
That
think I
totally makes
appreciate
sense.
some things better. I think it comes with age. I don't know.
Yes, that's true. It's an appreciation. That's the
Yeah.
thing. It's an appreciation. So, yeah.
Yeah. But I was I was emailing back and forth with Stephen Bruns from Colorado.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he said, by the way, to pass his regards. Yeah, he's been extremely helpful. I cannot believe that I actually made contact with him through a student that actually goes to Westchester, and he's a young composer. And then he said, "Oh, I know Mr. Bruns, and he's a very important person regarding the legacy of George Crumb." So, okay, well. And now we've been corresponding almost daily. He sent me some sketches of George Crumb of both volumes of Macro, and I was looking over them earlier, and I got really emotional regarding the
Yeah, I
compositional
can imagine.
process.
Yeah.
A lot of sketches about 120 for just 24 pieces in the end. 120 sketches, big sketches, and a lot of markings that were very much adjacent to the music he was thinking about, and thoughts like, oh, maybe I should write a macro 3, maybe something like that. Some thinking out loud on the page.
Yeah.
It was
Very George.
I cannot wait to
Yes,
hear what
Stephen.
you hear.
Yeah, I was going to say Stephen also was with George when they were doing the last sets of recordings. I think he sat in on those. It seems like I saw a picture of him sitting next to George where they had earphones on and they were recording.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I miss George. I think we all do, though.
I never met him in person, but it's funny because so he passed away in 2022, and then in the spring of 2023. As it happens every year at Temple, Professor Orkis gives this modern music class. It's required for all DMA students. And it happens only in the spring. And of course I had to take it. And that was the first time when I came in contact with his music. I had heard about him as an American composer back when I was in Romania, but I never had the chance to experience his music, let alone to see his scores and everything. And again, I think it had to do with the level of interest in that environment for this kind of music.
Yeah.
And yeah, so Professor Orkis was the one to open up this world. And
that totally makes sense. Yeah, I know. Oh,
so
yeah.
Okay, so starting from the beginning, how did you meet George Crumb, and what was your first impression about him as a person and his music?
Well, I knew his music before I met him. The first time I heard his music, it was in my undergraduate days at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. I was a flute performance major, and I think my flute teacher played me Voice of the Whale. And I took a beginning, like a composition class for non-majors. And I remember the teacher playing Black Angels, the opening of Black Angels, which scared the daylight out of all of us. I mean, really. But I also was kind of amazed by the intensity. And I remember with Voice of the Whale, I was kind of shocked at how much it felt like I was listening to whale song. I was so stunned by that piece. It was so different than everything else I was studying. I was playing a lot of new music, but George's music seems to be completely different than every other contemporary composer. And I think the first time I met him, God, was that when I was a student? It might have been when I was a student at Penn, when I started my master's there. I can't remember. He was so painfully shy, to be quite honest. And I'm always hesitant to approach people who are famous. I mean, I don't like bothering them or anything like that. But I do remember I started exploring more of his music once I got to Philadelphia. I went to Curtis. I think that's when I met Hugh, actually. Hugh might have been a student there right after me. But we were pretty close overlap. Everyone at Curtis kind of overlaps. It's like a big family. And I don't know if I went to a couple of concerts in Philadelphia that had George's music before I met him. But I really, really met him when I was basically starting my master's degree. I think I might have had him right out of the gate. I think I had him for lessons in the first year. Maybe it was the second semester. But he's the one composer that I've met, and I've met so many composers, but he's the one composer I've met whose music has a real intensity, but he's like the Southern gentleman. I mean, truly the Southern gentleman. And he was so quiet. It was so different than his music, which has this like explosive intensity, really intensity. Yeah. And oh my gosh, his sound world just kind of blew me away. And everyone who was studying at Penn, I remember this at the time because we had a meeting with a dean higher up in the colleges. They went around the room and asked, I think George was thinking about retiring. They went around the room and asked everyone, why are you at Penn? And every single person at the table said for George Crumb. Right. It was really, it was obvious he was the draw at Penn. But he was so shy, it's kind of amazing when I think about it, because I'm like, he's so painfully shy, and he speaks so quietly, he had this great Southern accent. It was kind of amazing, but his music was so intense. And there was this one incident I remember. There was some birthday concert that was being given up in New York City. And one of the other teachers at Penn, Jay Reese, he taught composition. Jay was a lot younger than George, and Jay drove a whole bunch of us up in his car to Manhattan to this concert. And they were doing one of his pieces. I can't remember which piece it was, but the players were all supposed to tap a Cortali, walk off the stage. And I remember everyone who went off tapped it very lightly and gently. And they had put George up there to conduct, although they didn't need a conductor, but they just thought it would be good if George conducted one of the pieces. And George was like the last person off the stage. And when he hit the Cortali, he like whacked it so hard we all jumped. So I remember thinking, his music has this intensity to it that's incredible, but he's so soft-spoken and quiet and shy. He's literally the only person I've met who composes. Normally people's music fits their personalities.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So George, I thought George has a whole universe inside himself that is unique. And it is like an entire universe. And I remember going to Penn, CDs came out part of the way through the time I was at Penn, and they were just starting to become a thing. I remember having a seminar with George, and he was always slow to adopt the technology of the day. And I remember he took a CD and went to put it on the record player, and we were all like, no, George, don't put the CD on the record player. That's not where it goes. We all like ran over and said, let us do that. Let us handle it. And he always wore a stopwatch around his neck. That's how he told the time. He had time. But every time the time changed in the spring and the fall, he was always off for an hour for like weeks. His perception of time,
was different.
His perception of time, I know
Yeah.
it was tricky, and he'd always be like, "Oh, am I seeing you for a lesson now?" You pass him on the hall, and like, "No, no, George, I'm going to see you on Tuesday. It's not time for my lesson." But he always felt like he was moving in a different universe. He's one of the few people I've met on the planet who just felt like he wasn't quite here, that he constantly lived in this other universe, the universe of a sound. And, it's interesting. One of the things, I had grown up in East Tennessee in the mountains, and I remember thinking about, he didn't say a lot in lessons. This is the really weird thing, but there's something about the way he reacted to music that he looked at, and him talking about Mahler and Debussy, how much he loved them, and instinct also, the way he thought about instinct being a very important part of composing. I could tell from listening to him talk and then listening to his works that his works were filled with a spookiness that you hear when you live out in the country at the foot of mountains. So mountain lions, the distant sound, how sound gets distorted when you hear it coming over a lot of miles, especially on hot nights, because the area I lived in was very much like the area he grew up in West Virginia. And I think his music, I realized after being around him, his music was the same soundtrack that I had heard growing up in East Tennessee. And it was the speed of the summer nights. It was the sound kind of distorts, and it comes at a great distance. I can remember hearing a marching band that was practicing like 10 miles away from the farm I lived on, but the sound was distorted in a way that I was like, oh, this is George Crumb. This is where this comes from. And hearing the bobcat screaming at night, which is like a woman screaming. I remember thinking, listening to whippoorwills and creeks running in the rocks when you walk across rocks and mountain creeks. I thought, this is totally George. This is where this all comes from, the spookiness of the mountains at night. There's magic there, but there's also stuff that you don't know what it is, and the sounds are pretty spooky.
Yeah, he speaks a lot about
haunting.
Echo. That's the
Yes.
I would say the key word in his music. He speaks a lot about it. He says, I remember in one of the interviews, and also in the book American Composers by, I forget the first name, Strickland. I think you know.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. He details about the fact that a person born, for example, West Virginia, and here's that's exposed to this kind of environment and part of nature, because it's nature, has their brain is influenced differently than from a person, for example, born in New York or born in in a more urban environment.
I think that's absolutely true, and I've had caught think about this from doing interviews myself, and because I started really late in music, when I won a Pulitzer, I remember everybody was asking me, how the heck did you go from being self-taught and starting so late to winning a Pulitzer? And it made me really stop and think. I'm like, I don't know, how did I get here? I have no idea. But I realized, I kind of made a connection back to George. I thought, a composer grows up in a sound world, and the language that they speak, but the environment around them really influences their perception of time. Yeah. Time moves differently in the Southern Appalachian regions. It does move slower. Things happen slower. They don't happen on a fast scale. And the echo thing is a real thing, because you hear the sounds bouncing off of elements of nature. It's really kind of a strange thing, but it's real. I totally understand what George's music is after having really sat back and reflected on, oh yeah, I remember that sound of whippoorwill or voices of people, but are they voices of people? It might be a bobcat. I mean, it really, you start realizing that you can't tell what the sounds are, but they are very evocative, which I always think George's music is very evocative. It's interesting. But he's right. And the speed of his speaking kind of matches the calmness of his music before the explosions that happen. It's interesting. It's fascinating. The thing I thought was fascinating, I asked other students who were already at Penn, had been there, I said, so lessons, do you have a recommendation? What's a good way to handle lessons with George? And they said, well, listen, he's very shy to say things about your music, but go in with questions. So, and it was funny, I would take in a traditional piece, like I was writing a viola sonata, and it was very traditional. I mean, kind of in the style of like along the lines of like Rebecca Clark and Hindemith's viola sonatas. But then when I took in, I have other pieces that really have a lot of extended techniques. George could make a lot of comments on that, but he also wouldn't really say that much. I think he was very shy about saying things to students. But I do remember him talking about the importance of instinct, and that made a profound impression. But his imagination with extended techniques, just, it still blows me away. And I use a lot of extended techniques in my pieces, even in the more traditional or simple stop stuff. I don't go to the extent that George does, but I kind of marvel at George's ability to dream up sounds. It's kind of incredible. I think there was a lot of pressure on George to find his own voice. I remember him telling me, waking up at one point one night in a cold sweat, he said it terrified him that he wasn't doing anything of any value that was any different than what anyone else had done. And sometimes that terror inside a composer, someone who really wants to create something original, sometimes that's just enough to get you to step outside the comfort zone that most people reside in.
I think Leonard Bernstein said something like, in order to be successful, something like, in order to get something done, you need a plan and not quite so much time. You feel the pressure of time, what we call time or perceive as time.
Yeah, and which is interesting because George wouldn't take commissions. I remember seeing an interaction backstage at the Philadelphia Orchestra. I'm trying to remember this. Yo-Yo Ma played 3 concertos with the Philadelphia Orchestra. There was a Chris Rouse piece and a Richard Danielpour piece and a Leon Kirshner piece. That's all they did on the program were these 3 concertos. And George and Liz Crumb went because Rouse had studied with George. Now, George thought this was very amusing. Christopher Rouse applied to Penn but couldn't get in. But he moved to Philadelphia so he could study with George. And that always made a real impression on George, because while I was at Penn, Rouse won the Pulitzer. I remember this, George telling me this story. And I was backstage with Liz and George. They were standing quietly back amongst the chaos of 3 different composers were back there, and Yo-Yo, which meant there was a crowd. And Yo-Yo Ma spotted George, and he went running over, and he said, "Oh my God, you're George Crumb, you're George Crumb." And I'm like, oh my God, Yo-Yo Ma is geeking out over someone. That kind of blew my mind, because Yo-Yo Ma is like the most famous musician on the planet. So to watch him reacting to George, and he immediately, Yo-Yo goes, "I need a piece. I want you to write me a piece, George. Write me a piece." And George is like, he was very sweet. He says, "Oh, I don't take commissions." He said, I just don't. And literally Yo-Yo turned to Liz Crumb and said, "You've got to make him do it. You've got to lock him in his studio. Only put food under when he sends out a sheet of music." And Liz Crumb was like, "Oh God, George would starve. He would just starve," because and he told me he wouldn't take commissions because he didn't know how slow or fast the ideas would come. And around the time I was studying at Penn, he was having a kind of a massive crisis. He didn't want to repeat himself. And he literally went several years without writing. And I remember him getting himself out of this roadblock. He said he built a stone fence in their yard in Media. And I remember at the time that I was at Penn, George said it was the most exceptional group of people coming through it. That was a really amazing. Jennifer Barker, who's Scottish, who was at University of Delaware, she was there. Oswaldo Golihov was there. Alfred Ben-Amontz, who now teaches out at Colorado State. David Crumb, George's son, was also there at that time. But it was an exceptional group of a lot of talent. Mike Fide, who now is at Cincinnati Conservatory. And we all hung out a lot together. But I think George at that time was really worried about having an original voice. He didn't want to repeat himself. But I also think just kind of that mass of students took up more brain room for him, took up more room in his imagination. So it was an interesting time for him. He started writing after I graduated there, and I don't know if he was approaching retirement, and he decided to write things for his daughter, and that was one of the things that kind of got him out of that space. But I also think he accepted the fact that he was George Crumb. which is really weird sounding, but that's
Yeah.
George's sound is so unique. But I think he wanted to be able to step away from that, but it wasn't the universe that he lived in. And thank goodness he honored that by writing more music.
I had last week an interview with James Freeman, and he mentioned that George Crumb was offered a position at Swarthmore College, which would have been closer to his home in media rather than UPenn. But he took up the job at UPenn because he thought that there would be graduate students, and they were graduate students, and he just wanted probably more,
Yeah.
high level people in, say, in training.
It makes a big difference. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
going to say it makes a
yeah,
huge difference in training. That
yeah,
it's really,
yeah.
and it's a different way of approaching, but you also don't have to hold hands as much. That's the thing. You don't have to hold the student's hand and say, you need to do this, you need to do that.
Yeah.
So, and when I think back on it, the composers studying at Penn were all really different. We all had really different styles, and George respected that. That wasn't always the case in a lot of composition schools, but I think it's because George was so unique unto himself that he could respect the students and what they would bring in. Because when I listen to all of our pieces now, I'm like, wow, there's not one of us that writes alike. And we also all realized, I remember us talking about that, you didn't dare copy George's language or anything because no one could do it as well as George. So it was an interesting time. It was interesting having David Crumb there, his son, because I could tell David was wrestling with a lot of things. He'd been a cello performance major at Eastman. Yeah. So, but I think David was trying to find his own identity as well. It was an amazing time at Penn. When I look at the people who came out of there, every single person went into a job, a pretty big job. Even like Ricardo Zonmo-Dunes at Eastman. It was a really exceptional group, and we were all really close. But George, it's amazing. I'm like, where did he come from? It's from another
Yeah,
planet. It's
yeah,
it's interesting. Smart man. He made me think about acoustics of instruments, and I use that to this day when I'm like writing for orchestra. Even though I write more traditional pieces, I think about the balances that George came up with, how he handled textures. And I remember him talking to me about being really uncomfortable about writing orchestra works. He really didn't like his orchestra. He didn't like writing them. It was those pieces are very hard to play. I remember being at a festival where one of them was being put together, and it was extraordinary how much rehearsal it took. Because the truth is, George's cosmic world fit into a chamber setting because the amount of rehearsal and understanding of all the layers and the colors and the execution of some of the techniques are not the kinds of things orchestras normally
do, of
do.
course.
Yeah, yeah, amazing guy.
You said a word that made me think of playing his music, instinct. He
Yeah,
talks about in his interviews, he encourages players to, okay, of course you have to follow everything that he wrote on the page, because clearly he put a lot of time and effort and thinking into writing why a fermata would last for 3 seconds or 7 seconds or 13 seconds, if I remember correctly from Macro 1. But of course, in the end, it's just it's the performer's moment, right, and the space that the music is happening, and of course the instrument on which the music is happening. And I think it's a very important element, instinct. I think without instinct, you cannot play this music. Not correctly.
yeah.
Correctly, yes, you
That
can play it
that's a
correctly, sure, of
yeah.
course. But then it would not be, I think, so convincing and so impacting, right, on the audience.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
And I think he emphasized, I know with me, he emphasized the instinct thing because that's the way I write. I do not ever think theoretically, ever, ever, ever. I mean,
thank
I
you.
had all the normal training.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I know and there was some validation in George saying that, and being aware that he thought that way meant that it kind of gave you permission, which when you're getting a doctor, you have to be able to explain everything. He gave you permission to step away from feeling that confined, that
Yeah,
panic you're trying to get
yeah,
things.
yeah.
Yeah. it really that and for an artist, I think there's something about that that's really valuable. It's not something that gets taught in school
No.
because you can't explain instinct. But George convinced me it was everything. Honestly, that I think it was just the little things he said. It's not that he ever said, Jennifer, you got to go by instinct. He just talked about how important it was and how he felt like it was in Mahler and all the pieces that he loved. And he said, look at Bach. He said, God, that guy wasn't really thinking theoretically. You know, he wrote so much music. It had to be by instinct. And then he turned to me and said, you know, playing Bach on the piano is like, it's like reading the Bible every day. I was
It's
like,
true.
yeah,
It's true. It keeps you
yeah,
healthy and in
true.
shape, and not just intellectually or finger wise, but it just keeps you healthy overall. It's like
Yeah.
wellness. It's a wellness.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you'd hear him playing too. You would go room where he was teaching and you could hear him playing some Bach. You could actually hear him doing it. So you could tell that he did exactly as he was talking about.
Yeah. Wow. Then you are actually answering all the questions that I had prepared. Thank you, actually. And but yes, thank you as a performer who has performed a lot of new music. Thank you for going by instinct and not primarily by brain, because I don't know, maybe there are performers that find that appealing, and but I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. It is an interesting time that George was able to maintain his style because there was a lot of pressure at that time for people to write with this more atonal. And I didn't feel that. I didn't like, and I know a lot of people who majored in composition and stopped because they didn't feel that that was the right thing for them. The fact that George's music was so convincing and it was so out of the norm from what was being done everywhere else, that everyone
Right.
else was writing in systems, it was such the perfect example of, this is art. And I remember when I was a flute performance major, I played a lot of new music. There's a new music festival at Bowling Green. I can remember some music never felt natural no matter how much you practiced it. And then there were those pieces like Crumb that resonate in a way that your
Yeah.
soul says, oh, I'd like to spend a little more time in this world. That's a big thing.
You know what I found interesting? I think it was the very first time when I did not find difficult to memorize contemporary music, because usually you play it on the score, like 99.9% you play with the score in front of you. But then last year I gave a performance in Germany and I wanted to include some of the pieces of macro one, of course not all of them, and I challenged myself, okay, let me see how much of them I can memorize. And it was surprising because it's such a logical writing there. I don't know. Even theoretically, it is logic. It is harmony. There are
Yeah.
sequences.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of jigsaw puzzles. And
Yeah.
I found that music to be exactly like a jigsaw puzzle. Of course, you learn it, you play it, you play with the score, whatever. But then, if you're trying to memorize, which is a different process, when you play music by heart than when you play with the score in front of you, it's a different process. And boy, it's just all the pieces just align, and it's I found it to be logical, and I thought, yep, this music can be memorized, no problem, because it
Yeah.
has
That's
it
interesting.
has first of all, it has meaning, it has a logic, and it has an idea behind it, not just from an ethos point of view, or from like an emotional point of view, but also the way compositionally it's very well planned. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just my perception, but I found it to be quite
It makes
liberating.
sense.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
logical.
yeah.
Has anyone told you that George used to put his manuscript paper up on the wall? That he
I
often would
have
like
read about.
have,
Yeah,
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 he'd have something written on, like not a lot written on one section, and then he'd put something in somewhere else. So I think I always got the feeling George pieced things together, not knowing which pieces of the puzzle were going to fit where, and that
exactly
they
that.
slowly
Yeah,
evolved. Yeah.
yep. So it's
Which
like one
I think
piece.
that's also good.
So I don't. How do
Yeah.
you find this from a composer's point of view? This kind of
It
technique, because
gave
I
me
think it's a technique,
yeah,
right?
I often do it this way now. I do sketches and I don't always know where the sketch is going to fit. So some pieces, like when I wrote an opera, I went from beginning to end, maybe because I was following a story. But oftentimes I'll write some music, and then I'm like, okay, this is a multi-movement work. Where belong? And so I kind of got that from George. Like,
Right.
okay, you can write from the middle out, which I've done with pieces before. And I sometimes will actually challenge myself to just keep everything interesting, to start in the middle and then back up and write maybe 16 bars leading up to a phrase, and then think, okay, I need to expand that back up a little bit more. So knowing that George did this told me that things need to grow organically for them to make sense organically for the performers. That you have to find, there's no reason, there's no rule anywhere that says you have to start at the beginning and go to the end. You can totally start anywhere. It just, whatever idea comes to you first, go with that and see what you can make out of
Out
it,
of it, yeah.
and then build around that. Because if you're feeling it and it's instinctively good, he used to say, instinct will never mislead
I
you.
like
He
that.
always
Yeah.
said that. And I always, yeah,
Yeah, I like that.
he's right. He's absolutely right. Because there have been times where I've tried to force music to go somewhere. And if I gave in and put it aside and started something else, that's the next alley, the next street was the right street. So George was right. Instinct leads you correctly, I think, every time. I haven't found anything that contradicts that yet.
It's interesting because what you said at the beginning, that his personality didn't align or contradicted the musical personality, or the music that he would write, but then what he did
Yeah.
and the way he thought aligned very well with
Yeah.
how he wrote music. So the way his music presents itself is very
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
the way he spoke about it and the way he thought about it. It's very, very interesting, this.
Yeah. I often think it's a little bit like planets when they hypothesize of space. Space forms from inside out, exploding out. And I always think George's music probably does the same thing. I'd be willing to bet in Black Angels, he wrote that God music, segments of that God music, way before he was at that point in writing. I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's really, I know. It would be interesting. I guess, I don't, George probably never kept track of the order of things, the way it got written in a piece, which would really be fascinating to look at. But the thing that I appreciate about George is the fact that, like you say, you observed he had questions.
Yeah.
He's always asking questions, and I think a lot of composers don't do that. They have questions. They just kind of proceed along. They settle for anything. George worked over the material and over the material, and constantly worried about, how do I make this interesting? I think this was an obsession. How do you make it interesting? Every note, every phrase, and every dynamic is important. A lot of composers leave that stuff out. George is so meticulous about it that it's, I also admired his, because when I was coming out of grad school, we were still doing everything by hand.
Right.
So George was held at, he was the top of the mountain, because we'd all look at Black Angels and go, oh my gosh, how did that man do that? So it's really, there was something about the art of the music, the way it looked, that also held something special that you didn't find in other pieces.
Well, he used to say, music that sounds good must look good on the page. So that's why
Yeah.
he was very much preoccupied with the visuals as much as, the
Yeah.
what comes
Yeah.
out, what you hear.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I could see in the sketches of both Macro 1 and 2, same thing. It's just the ending of, let's say, Proteus in the first volume, like right the ending, and then everything else, if you look the top of the page, blank, or just the beginning, just the first bar, or not even a bar, but just a motif, like a melodic thing, and then the ending, and then the next sketch is a little bit more detailed, but still not quite there yet. And if you know the final version, the final outcome, you see, like, boy, he's come a long way. Wow, that was a long process of thinking and putting pieces together so that they fit organically. I like this word. It makes a lot of sense, what you said.
Yeah.
It feels very
I think
organic.
it was George. I think it's also George's growing up in nature, because things don't feel so organic in cities, but when you live out in nature and you take lots of walks, it feels that way. There's a logic. Nature dictates where the trees are, how the water runs, the way the sun comes through. There's a logic, even the way a tree is constructed, the rings inside, the leaves, that all of it. So I suspect George was probably, actually, I'd never thought about this, but now that I'm saying this, when George was growing up, all of his musical experiences were via radio, so he had to use his imagination.
Yeah, it was viral. Yeah.
And so that probably made the world very different and his hearing very different, because if you grow up listening to radio and that's where you get a lot of your information, if you're listening to those concerts that they used to play, the classical concerts, and I know then he got scores and he was looking at them, that's very different than like what we have today where people are on YouTube and they have music
True.
notation programs that play things back from MIDI, but it lacks imagination. I mean, I can see with students now, I can see the less, I guess people are not using their imagination as much as like George did growing up in an Appalachian area where the radio was the source of the music and the piano and the things you had in the house.
Right.
But you know what? He was meant to be a composer. I mean, Liz talked about how much he'd get in trouble at school. I think it was like junior high or grade school or something for bringing scores in. I always thought that was like priceless, just priceless. He played in the Delaware Youth Orchestra. They started that. George and Liz Crumb started the Delaware Youth Orchestra, and George played in the viola section along with all the kids. They didn't have enough violas, and so George went in.
Wow. I didn't know he could play the viola because he never mentioned that, or at least I never found it, that piece of information.
Yeah, I only know this because Mindy Wagner, the composer, had studied with George, and she used to play in that orchestra, and she said George was sitting there like sawing away in the orchestra. And Liz ran that orchestra for a very long time. I mean, it was really, it may have been decades even. So, but I went out there once. I had a performance with them, and Liz was talking about George playing in the orchestra. There weren't a lot of kids, and they were trying to fill in sections that didn't have instruments, so George volunteered to play viola. I was like, George played viola?
Yeah,
oh my gosh, that's just
yeah.
It's very interesting.
Okay, I guess it's that kind of a orchestra man, right? I think that was my understanding, and before I knew this, I mean, I know we all know he played clarinet, or his father made him learn clarinet, and then of course piano. But I don't know, to my brain, I have always perceived him as an orchestra man, I think, because he could write for any instrument. I think he had this ease of writing for any instrument that presented a very interesting timbre, or at least find interesting sounds to come up out of any instrument.
His openness to finding the sounds is also one of the keys, the imagination, that he wanted to push the instruments beyond, really to push them beyond. I sometimes wonder, did this start with his fascination with Mahler and the bells and things in Mahler? You know what I mean? It's interesting, but nature does have its own music. And when you live in a place that mountains and streams and things and the rocks, you do start to realize there's something to that. It's really in George's music. And you go hiking in the woods, it fits. It does.
And he also he found the same. I think he found the connection between the night music that he had experienced in nature, in Bartók's music and Mahler's music. I mean, specifically Nacht music, right? So then he continued the lineage in a way.
Yeah. It's interesting, George, a lot now I'm thinking about it, because I published my own music, which has allowed me to make a living as a composer. And it was George's advice when I was a student, because he regretted signing over some of his earlier works, that he said, I wish I could have withdrawn, that I didn't want out in the world. Once I learned more about composing, I didn't feel as good. And I think he actually bought back the pieces or something. He cost him a lot of money, but he's like, don't go to the publishers, wait till they come to you. He had that. And it actually was smart advice. It really turned out that it was unusual advice too. No one was doing it when I was coming out of grad school. Everyone was trying to submit stuff to Boozy and G. Schirmer, and George was like, just wait. And it was smart. It was good advice. It was really good advice.
But how can this advice matches an era where there's a lot of competition and you have to basically market yourself and promote yourself? And
The thing I learned from George is you can't market yourself. The music has to sell itself. That's the thing I learned from George. You can't. And what I also had
Yeah.
discovered through the years is the publishers don't market. They don't market anymore. They used to a long time ago, but they're stretched so thin. And so I remember thinking about this when I was coming out of grad school. Do I send pieces in? And I thought about this. Philip Glass had said
Mm.
to a bunch of us when I was an undergrad at the music festival in Bowling Green, he said, if you want to be a composer who makes a living, keep the copyright to your pieces, which I vaguely remembered. But George was advising us on this, and it was just as like Staples and Office Max were coming out, and just as computers were coming in and good printers. And I thought, maybe I'll just do this myself. And so my publishing has become huge. And Boozy and G. Shermer have both tried to buy my catalog. But I've since learned that it's much smarter to handle it yourself, let the music sell itself. Because the truth is, you can't advertise. That's never going to get people to
Yeah.
play the music. The music has to speak to the musicians. But I think George knew that also from playing piano and thinking about what he liked in music and what he didn't like in music and what he thought works. So he was I think he was subconsciously taking things apart with Mahler and Bartok and Debussy. They're all different, but they all share similar things. They do things instinctively, but Debussy was known as a rule breaker,
Oh
a
yeah.
really
Yep.
serious
Yep.
teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I could tell that appealed to George. It's really,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
appealed to me too, as well. But George's advice turned out to be he would never have imagined my ability to sell so much music that I can make a living. Like I do better than the regular publishing houses. We get like 4 or 5 orders a day. So, and I probably have about
Wow.
300 performances a year. It's a lot
It's a
of
lot.
perform. In fact, I
Yeah.
just had yesterday there was a doctoral student, saxophonist at University of Michigan, who was he did his doctoral concert, kind of like what you're doing, on like 5 of my pieces plus a commission that I had written for him and his quartet. And I think about it now because one of the things I learned right after Penn, coming out of Penn, was the music needs to be affordable and you need to get it out quickly to people, because getting a hold of music is often difficult for the performers and it shouldn't be a barrier. And I can remember
Right.
trying to order George's music and having problems getting it. And I thought,
Yeah.
this is ridiculous. It shouldn't be that way. You should be able to purchase orchestra scores. You should be able to purchase, the solo for a concerto, the solo and the piano reduction, which you can't always do for things.
Yeah.
So George affected me in more ways than I probably realized until talking to you, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much interested, or equally interested, in finding out how he influenced successful composers as much as performers. So,
Yeah.
besides the interview with you, I talked to James Freeman, I talked to Professor Orkis first, just because he was right there at Temple, and I'm gonna talk to Dr. Abramovic a little bit more closely in terms of when he played his music, or Marc Antonio Barone a little bit later in March.
Yeah.
These are direct influences. I cannot get
Yeah.
closer than that,
Yeah.
since he
Totally.
passed away, right? So I just,
Yeah.
different personalities, different careers,
Yeah.
different approaches. So, influenced by the same man, the same musician. So
Yeah.
it's not just the purpose is not just to fill out my dissertation. It's not about that. It's to get insight, to get input about his music from different sources like this, so that
Yeah.
I know better what I have to do and how to think about it. Right? I wish I could talk to Beethoven directly, or I could talk to his contemporaries. Actually, we can, through the books that were written by his contemporaries,
Yeah.
and letters. I mean, that's the best way to get into his mind.
Yeah.
But if I can do this, why not? So it's just
There's something interesting. I've forgotten about this. When it seems like around the time I had graduated from Penn, some piano rolls came out that were Debussy playing his
oh
piano
yeah, yeah, yeah,
works.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Pedals were held down like longer than pianists normally do. Like, so there was much more of a blur of sound. And I think I remember, because I would go to concerts still up at Penn. It seems like I remember George laughing about that, because he's very specific about his pedaling, which now I always think about pedaling. I'm not a pianist, but I think about the resonance of the instrument, and I'm
Yeah,
often marking it. So
yeah.
I Yeah, that's it. It is fascinating. I think he realized that you do
Interesting.
have to mark. And I remember asking that, how do you know how much to mark? When I wrote my piece Rapid Fire when I was in grad school, the piece is extraordinarily difficult. It's very virtuosic and it's highly notated because George said you may not be there to coach it. They maybe the first time they're doing new music, you've got to mark everything. So
Interesting.
it was an important lesson, and I followed that since then, even with large orchestra pieces, because I realized we got limited time, and it helps the musician to know your intent. And I can't be there most of the time when pieces are being done. So it was an important lesson from George. And looking at his music, you could tell he really felt that way.
Interesting. Is the same, you used exactly the same words I used, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I had to go into a composition class at Temple, as part of the AI that I have, and to speak to the students about how to write for the piano in terms of what the piano can do, pedaling. I had a like 10-15 minutes of talking about pedaling, and I asked them, please, 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 just to be efficient with time, and
Yeah,
to make the performer happy, whether it's me or someone else. And if you're
yeah,
not there to coach the piece, mark down as much as you can. You cannot put everything down, of course. There's
yeah,
also a limit, but as much as you can, write down, because don't assume the performer can understand everything. Don't assume that.
yeah. And composers are terrified to mark things down because they don't understand the instruments. That's
Yeah,
what when I teach
that's
composition,
exactly.
that's what I discovered.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to leave it up to the performer. I'm like, there's a big difference in the sound with each thing that you do on an instrument. You can't assume it's going to be what you want. You have to
Yeah.
pretend you're not there to coach it.
Here's a question that I might actually use it for this composition class, just to make my life easier, because I have to play the works of those students at some point.
Yeah.
So George Crumb definitely knew the instrument, right? Knew the piano, knew
Hmm.
the capabilities of the piano. He discovered actually more things that that instrument can do. But what about the physicality? Because at first, when I started playing his music, I thought, oh, he was a performer. He was definitely a virtuosic pianist. And then I found out, no, I mean, he had played the piano, he had taken lessons, but he could play, clarinet, viola. Now he was a percussionist. I remember Professor Orkis telling me he was a percussionist, and I thought, how is that possible? Because everything seems so natural on the keyboard. It seems pianistic, what we call pianistic or violinistic, or
Right.
how. Yes, how would you know that if you're not a virtuosic performer,
Pianist. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
any
It's
instrument,
it's it's really tricky, composers, ideally you study a lot of scores to look at how people handle instruments. When I was in Philly, I would always go into Curtis, I'd write things for strings, and I'd pop into a practice room and ask, because I always knew that if the performers could do it and if they could suggest something that was better, it was better to go. And what I've learned is a lot of composers don't have never played an instrument, so they have no empathy what it's like to be on the other side of the music stand trying to
yeah,
bring a piece to life, and that it's totally different reality. In fact, I often think schools ought to make composers all play in some amateur chamber ensemble, even if they're reading stuff together, even if it's really bad, because the experience of sitting there and having to do page turns and figure out, oh, you're a trumpet player, you can't make them play the entire time. They've got to have breaks. Every group of
yeah,
instruments has different rules that you've got to be careful about. Oboe players have died from playing too much. They've had brain aneurysms. You have to really think about this. But what I have found talking to composers through the years is there's not a way to educate them, even though the only thing they can do is write and then hear played what they're doing. And they learn that way. If they're smart, they'll ask the performer, is there something I can do here? This looks awkward. Is there something I can change here that would make it work? And so I don't know, when you go to play their pieces, maybe it's worth giving them feedback on the writing and how they handle the
yeah,
instrument.
yeah.
Because now everybody writes with a computer and they think because they can put it on MIDI, they all use this stupid 4 notes, a pattern. It drives me crazy. But when I go in and talk to composers, I tell them when I judge competitions, we'll have 300 scores and 150 and we'll start exactly the same way. And that tells you the composer has no imagination. That's all
Interesting.
because they use the exact same gestures. And I said,
Gestures,
that'll
yeah.
get your piece tossed out. Yeah. And always when I say this in front of composers, about half the room has a reaction like, oh no, I started my piece that way. I can tell that that is a common thing, usually a repeating pattern that just over and over. They don't even vary it, which means it's not interesting for the performer.
Yeah.
And it also can hurt them, I mean, it's the same pattern, just da 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 da. It's all it is, and I'm like, not interesting. So sometimes I make composers sit down and look at, like Crumb, look at the shape of his gestures. How much of the keyboard does he hit? Are the notes close together? Are they in clusters? What is effective on what part of the piano? Because composers often make the mistake of staying right in the middle,
Yeah.
around middle C.
Yeah. And
I'm like,
that's the first thing you learn. You just, where's middle
yeah.
C?
And composers don't realize the power of the bottom of the piano. They don't realize the power of one line versus having that repetitive 16th note figure. It's an interesting thing. And what I have discovered is some composers don't care whether it's playable or not. And those people never compose after they leave school. And some people are really hungry to know. So it's interesting to push a little and see if they will take the information. And a lot of times the really good students will ask more questions. And
Right.
I often will just not worry about what you don't ask because they don't really want to know, but also means their music isn't going to sell itself because it doesn't work well for instruments and they don't really care whether it does or not.
Yeah, I mean,
It's an interesting philosophy.
Yeah, I'm very happy that we're talking about this because again, I'm not a composer, but as a performer, if I can work with composers, give them a piece of advice that can ease their work and my work eventually, then why not? But you were talking about repetitive patterns. There are repetitive patterns in Crumb's music, but for some reason, it's not.
They're for a reason. They're for a reason. That's the thing.
Yeah.
It has context that people work,
Yeah. Yeah, I can think of
It's
the areas, for example, in Macro 1. A lot of repetitive patterns. I mean, if you look at it, it really looks the same. If you look at the entire little piece, a lot of fast notes. It's only fast notes. But of course, in different registers, in different, I would say even different harmonies, because you can group the notes, which are very much horizontal. And how in the world are you going to memorize that? By just grouping and make some logical connections to you.
Right.
But it just works because melodically it makes sense. It has a beginning and it has an end.
Yes.
By using,
and there's harmonic change.
Yeah.
That's the thing. This is what's missing oftentimes with students. They get one figure and they put it like in all the orchestra and it's the exact same figure, same four notes. No harmony is implied because of the way they're writing. And I often know I can tell that they've never thought about harmony. And maybe you ought to put some counterpoint in there, something that's contrasting. George was so great. His rhythms have like this crispness to them that are, you can't ignore them. You can't ignore them. It's like he's coming at you with the staple gun or something. You know what I mean? You have to pay attention.
Yeah.
And he knows how to do it in a way that is explosive. I always wondered, did George ever yell in his life? Because his music yells sometimes.
Quite a lot.
Sometimes it yells.
Quite a lot.
Screams.
And he makes the performer yell. But that's the thing. He makes the performer yell.
Watching him hit that crotale, watching him hit the crotale when everyone else was just tapping it lightly, and then George walks over and wham, he hits that thing so hard. I thought, okay, this is intensity in a composer. We can hear it in his music, but you never see it in his personality. He's always very soft-spoken with a little southern lilt, and in fact, he didn't even like talking about his music. If he went to a new music festival and they wanted to do a talk, he was like, "Oh no, I don't want to talk about it." So, which I kind of understand because music is hard to explain verbally, and the way, the way George thought about it in particular, because it was instinct. You can't always explain instinct either.
No, I don't think you can. It's the same thing in piano lessons. I mean, a teacher can explain just, maybe using a few words, but then I think it's a much more valuable lesson for the student to sit down, pay attention, look at the teacher, if demonstrates, and just hear. For me, this is the best lesson. This is the best lesson. If words are not enough, and sometimes it's not, when it has to, when there's a technical problem, yes, you can describe the problem or offer solutions, but then in the end, it's still a visual thing. I've learned so much from just watching videos of pianists playing, great great pianists, Higdons, and wondering myself, how are they doing this? How do they do it? And then, of course, there are people that broke down technique of Marta Argerich, technique of Glenn Gould, technique of Horowitz, Russian technique, French technique. A lot of categorizers like that. But it's just a personal approach. It's personal experience. How do I see this person doing this and that?
So
and how,
that is one of the things watching George Crumb play your music. I remember Ricardo Zon Muldoon, before he went into a lesson, right before he went, he said, I don't know if I should have this lesson today. I've only got 4 chords on this piece. I only wrote 4 chords during the week. And we were like, I don't know. Ricardo, will go in and see what George says. So Ricardo took in these 4 chords. And he was in the room for like 30 minutes. And we were all still sitting in the lounge when Ricardo came out. And we said, how was it? What did George say? He said, I couldn't believe it. He said, he took those 4 chords and he actually played each chord, but he played them different durations and the way his hands moved. Ricardo said he could see he said the first chord, I could hear this going for 14 seconds. And then he played the next chord. This would be 16 seconds. And Ricardo's gestures were totally George's, but you could tell that George could hear an entire world in those 4 chords. And the way he talked to Ricardo about it, I could tell that George perceived time differently. But there was something about that lesson of George moving his hands. And a lot of times when he played piano, you could tell there was an inner world going on that we couldn't feel, that he was tapping into those composers. There was just like George had somehow he was plugged into a part of the universe that was electrical charged, the same one that Bartok and Mahler and Bach had tapped into. I mean, it was that obvious, but it was George's gestures, watching how he responded to music as well. It told you more than he would say, weirdly. You could see it in his hands when he would play something. Totally fascinating. You've actually brought up a lot of memories, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right.
Well, here's another one probably for you to think about. So you were talking about listening or even witnessing him playing the piano. This is like the first time for me that I ever hear a person saying this. Did you hear him playing? I would say traditional piano works. Of course, Debussy, for example, preludes. He was very fond of them. Something. I don't know, Bach, of course, but what would be his style of playing?
He could sit down and play a Mahler score. He was actually able to play. He was able to play better than people may realize, actually. But I think, like, my piano skills are really limited, so I have to use my imagination. George used his imagination, but his piano skill was better. But I didn't have a seminar with him where they examined a specific composer.
Right.
But everyone who had those classes said it was amazing to watch George play. Quite a few people, and I think he played a lot. And usually those seminars, it seems like my schedule never lined up when he was teaching it, but he would do just the Mahler symphonies, and he would sit there and play them, which is not so easy.
No.
That's actually good grief. I know. So I always thought of George first and foremost as a pianist, maybe because he was always sitting at the piano when he was talking. He always had a cigarette and an ashtray there. There was always a no smoking sign right there on the wall next to the piano, and there'd be all this smoke in the room, but I always got the feeling George's sonic sense was percussive on the piano. I think everything for him was a percussive effect.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, but his playing was not shabby. I'm not kidding. It was pretty amazing. And I'm trying to think, he must have coached. There must be someone who took his seminars who witnessed him playing, like a Oswaldo Galihov or maybe Ricardo Zon Muldoon. Ricardo was very slow speaking like George, and I always wondered what their lessons were like. It was kind of but he played quite a bit, apparently. I never saw him play as a performer on a stage. That one time they took him up on stage and asked him to conduct, but for some reason it was just for the look of George conducting. They didn't even do the dress rehearsal with George up there. Weirdly, it was kind of an odd thing. Yeah, it's fascinating. But yeah, his playing, watching his hands, the way he lifted his hands, you could tell time was going by even as the piano resonated. This is interesting.
Because it's like manipulating, but in a good way. It's like manipulating the sound through the instrument. I mean, either it can be piano or viola or anything, any instrument. It's just the medium that you manipulate the
Yeah.
sound with. And I think
I
it
think he could feel the vibrations too. I
yeah,
think he
yeah,
felt the vibrations like he was living
yeah,
inside the sound.
yeah,
That was kind of
yeah.
the impression I got.
You know, speaking of that particularly, the only pianist nowadays that literally does that, and it's so engaging visually, is Fazil Sai, and he's gonna play on Thursday at UPenn, and luckily we got some tickets.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, we went to
Yeah.
Carnegie last year to see him performing a solo recital. It's so engaging. It's so engaging, and it's peculiar in particular
Yeah.
to his style of
Yeah.
playing, but
Yeah.
it makes so much sense. He's conducting the vibrations of the
Yeah.
sound. That's my impression, and of
Yeah.
course the whole concept, the whole architecture of any work. It's very, very interesting that you
Yeah.
mentioned that.
It's George. I think seeing George around instruments, I, yeah, there's something about. I always got the impression he was living inside the sound, which was. If you just talked to him in the hallway, it felt like he was still in that sound, even though he wasn't at an instrument. He kind of had a. I don't want to say it's a space quality because there was a brilliance about George too, but it's just like he was in another world. But it was a sound world. It's like he had super sensitive awareness as a kid,
Yeah.
listening to the woods and the animals and the creeks and the rocks. It's kind of incredible.
Has that affected you
Magic.
as well? Has that affected you as well in the composition? Probably, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It changed kind of the way I thought about sound. And I took advantage of when I was writing my opera. I had scenes where there were storms going on, and there were things where the characters were talking about the sounds of nature, how the sounds of nature can lead you to clues to surviving. And so I ended up putting in it's a traditional opera orchestra in Santa Fe, a full orchestra, but the percussionists were using sticks. They were using sticks. I used rattlesnake sounds with percussion anytime any of the evil guys came on. So I kind of used that as a color motif throughout my writing. And I remember using a kid's toy, a thunder tube that would have the kind of this roaring. It's a little tube with a wire on it that kids buy for $5 that I used throughout the opera, and it worked. And I thought I used it percussively too. And I thought about George. I'm like, okay, I got to notate when they keep their hand on it, when the hand comes off, when do they just pop it and lift straight off? Can they put the metal tail on a music stand? I thought, oh, that's a really cool sound. So it's, in fact, the opera I have premiering in Pittsburgh in, when is that, end of April, is nothing but extended techniques for the 12 instruments that are playing in it. So it's got George's fingerprints all over it, basically. It's really,
So it's
but I wouldn't have done that had
symbols.
I not.
Yeah, it's symbols. When you said the rattlesnakes for the antagonistic characters,
Yeah,
it's symbols. It's all over, right? It's
yeah.
just
And it's very George. I mean, look at those piano pieces, you're like, oh, yeah, the cross, the crucifix, Agnus Dei.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I could
amazing.
tell by looking at the sketches earlier. I found the one page he drew the peace symbol, which is the symbol
Yeah,
for the 12th piece in the Macro 2, the Agnus Dei Capricorn. And he only drew a circle,
yeah,
and then that's it. That was for the entire page. So he had made up his mind, this is gonna be
yeah,
the symbol that characterizes, whatever idea he had for that.
yeah.
And then the music came after that. I could see that,
Right.
just to,
I think that's actually true. The visual element for him, he would think about how it was represented. It kind of I remember my flute lessons. My teacher, now looking back, she had some crumb up. And in those days, this would have been the early '80s. People took his music, a sheet of his music, and would put it in a frame and put it up in their office. And
yeah.
then I went to, and I'm like, oh yeah, oh yeah. I was always standing next to this image. It was kind of. And I never thought to ask her about it. I just thought it was art, like a piece of art. It
Art.
didn't occur to me that it was
Yeah.
something someone had written until later. Yeah, incredible stuff.
I'm really enjoying this conversation. Really. Oh my gosh. I'm so happy that you you made time for this. Really, it's very helpful. It
Listen,
pretty much confirms some things that I've been thinking about or feeling just by instinct, or learning from other people. It just finding out things.
yeah,
It's really, really helpful. And again, it's just for the performance, just to know
yeah,
what to do. Just these little
yeah,
details to add up to the baggage, just to know what to do and how to perform it, and just to give me more
yeah.
insight about a composer. It's just great that we
Makes
can
sense.
talk
Yeah,
about it. You know,
yeah, absolutely. I
yeah,
know. Oh, yeah.
that's really great. Wow. Yeah. Actually, I was thinking earlier, when I received the sketches, it's just there are so many. Like I said, it's almost 120. Just if I had room, how would I
Yeah,
place them on the wall? Just it's first of all, I don't have room because it's a lot of puzzles here, but
yeah.
it's just they are a work of art. They are
There
indeed.
must be there must be pictures around of his studio. There must be something somewhere. Someone must have taken a picture at some point of what his studio looked like. I mean, his
Yeah.
house in media was really modest. So and I never was in the studio. We were always in the kitchen putting stuff together with Liz if we were having a picnic outside. There
Right.
were dogs
I was
everywhere.
gonna
He
ask
loved
you
the
about
dogs.
dogs. That was my thought. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, his dogs. Yeah. He loved the dogs.
Yeah, I heard the
I know.
little suite, the Mundus Canis, the 5-piece suite, and it cracked me up. I swear. And I
I know.
listened to the Yoda piece over and over and over. There was that little white dog that really resembled Yoda, which was quite unusual. And
Yeah.
then the way he captured.
You know, when I was gonna say they did that concert at Swarthmore, and George was playing, and they let Yoda out at the end. They opened the door, and Yoda went running out onto the
Oh, that's
stage
so
just
cute.
with George. It was so amazing. And watching George play percussion,
Yeah.
he was so serious. It was kind of amazing. It's the first time I think any of us had ever seen him really perform, but he was so intense in the performance. But there was some beautiful humor in it. I feel like that piece was kind of a balm for George's soul in a certain way. It's really, I think he dealt with his son Peter. I think there was a more tragedy inside George, pain or something
Yeah,
that
especially.
existed in.
Yeah.
He didn't really ever talk about, and I wondered about that department at Penn because George Rockberg, one of his colleagues, he was really close with George Rockberg and Richard Wernick, but then both George Rockberg and Richard Wernick had sons die. And I always thought it was kind of a really weird thing, a weird coincidence that the three main
Yeah.
comp faculty there
Had kids that
had these
died.
issues.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I know.
interesting. I
It's
didn't know
very
about that.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I just
Yeah,
I
it does make you,
it doesn't make you it makes you wonder, right? It's kind
yeah.
of
The other thing that I hadn't really thought about in some of his later works, his son, or maybe this is actually even works that apply to the piano piece. His son Peter loved rock and roll and had a huge collection of records, like apparently it was thousands upon thousands of records. And I think Peter played that music at home all the time. So George must have been hearing that all the time. It must have been in the background. And Peter, I mean, I think there was an obsession about rock and roll, old rock and roll, new rock and roll.
yeah.
And so I sometimes wonder if it didn't influence some of the things that George, they kind of crept in an intensity in George's pieces.
Interesting. I think I remember vaguely reading something about that, maybe in the Petters compilation by Don Gillespie. The
Yeah, yeah,
articles and essays, and I think I do remember about this. That he said something, hearing rock and roll music in the background, exactly that.
yeah, yeah. It would have been Peter because I think
Yeah.
Peter obsessively listened to the rock and roll, but I also know that I think George and Liz worried a lot about Peter. He couldn't live on his own. I think that was it was a concern even when we were in school. And that was back in the late 80s, early 90s. So it was kind of interesting. It's It had to have affected him, though. I can't imagine that it didn't. And I'm still kind of amazed when Anne died. I don't realize Anne was sick, and I saw George
2019.
right before.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I saw George literally weeks before she died, but she must have been in chemo, having chemo at that point. And he didn't say anything about it. I was like, okay, is that the Southern thing where you don't talk about the family issues, but it comes out in George's music? Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
I
if you
think he
look at
always
it
felt
like
like
that,
he was
yeah.
hated, yeah, in some weird way because he was born around the stock market crash. I feel like he always felt like that was he mentioned it enough times that I thought, all right, this weighed on his mind, or maybe relatives said to him, "Oh, George, you came along when the stock market crashed." There was something about that stuck with George because I heard him mention it several times.
In terms of
So
living situation for families,
yeah,
I see.
not in terms of their financial situation,
Yeah.
but in terms of him, the timing of his birth in relation to the stock market crash in the beginning of the Depression. Now, it's possible that they were okay. I think a lot of people in Appalachian actually survived better than people who were in cities because they knew how to live off the land.
Yeah.
But because it was something that George mentioned quite a few times, he thought a lot about numerology. I
Yeah.
frequently wondered, did he feel like his birth was destiny or something, or it had to have a dark element or something like that? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating guy.
Definitely. I mean, we went to Romania in September last year, on the 15th of September, and we gave a concert at the conservatory, and it was quite I would say, emotional and special time for me for going back there after 5 years and playing on that stage where I had had juries and I had had performances and being under scrutiny so many times. Okay, and we went there, and for as part of the tradition for the forehand concerts, we each of us play something solo, whatever. Just we have solo moments each of. And I chose Crumb. I chose two pieces from Macro One, the Aries and the Gemini. Contrasting, very contrasting. And I figured that any kind of audience just needs a little bit of talking before playing this kind of music, even if they know it. I mean, you can't assume. So I just talked a little bit, and there were a lot of friends there, and some teachers, composers. Composers, of course, they knew about that kind of music, and started playing. And at the end, I received quite some appreciative remarks and feedback regarding the music. It's like, wow, I've never heard this music. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like it's appealing, so it captures attention. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It was like an experiment, and I decided to see. Okay, I marked it as experiment. The number one attempt number. I don't know. It was a success in terms
Yeah.
of it captured attention of the audience, and it said
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
That's my goal. That's why I just
Yeah. I think George, he does that. His music has some element in it that's missing in a lot of
yeah.
music in general. That there's just some sort of, I don't know. It's really fascinating. Sometimes I think that people can hear the intent that a composer has,
Yeah.
which is, again, you can't really explain, but I feel like George, when he committed to something on the paper, he'd really thought it through and he knew what he was trying to convey. It wasn't just notes, it was music. Whereas a lot of composers just convey notes. But I
Yeah.
think George's intensity and his intent in writing is I think the audience can feel it. I think the performer can feel it. I think the audience can feel it.
So when you hear
It's kind of interesting.
intentions, as a from a composer's point of view, when you hear intentions in a piece, but you just hear intentions, what's missing? What do you think it's missing there in order to be more than intentions?
I think the composer has to have been shooting for something. I don't think it's enough to put notes on a page. You have to be thinking about the feeling of the piece, which is something that never gets addressed in composition lessons. I don't think I ever had anyone mention that, but I always examined it when I was younger. I always thought, oh, this piece makes me feel this way. Rock and roll makes me feel that way. And I think I mean, George talked about a lot about Black Angels, the atmosphere when he wrote that piece, because the Vietnam War was going on, and he was very aware of electric guitars. I've coached that piece before with string quartets at Curtis, and it was always interesting to do that because it was so different. They were used to doing the Beethoven string quartets. I mean, just standard repertoire, but they could play it, but it always made the room electrical. I mean, literally, it felt electrical. It's interesting. George was aware of the times, and part of this is because he was a student on a campus at a time when there was a lot of activism on campuses because of the Vietnam War. So there was no way not to know what was going on in the world. Although George frequently didn't know what was going on in the world, during that time, there was no way to ignore it. So, but I think it must have really hit him in a way that made him think, how can I capture this and put it on a page? And I talk to a lot of composers, and they're just putting notes on a page. They don't ever think about this question about what do you want to convey. And I obsess about that kind of thing, but most composers don't. And I don't know that George even consciously thought about it, but everything he puts on the page feels like it belongs there.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case with most music. It's that way with Bach. I always feel like that with Mozart and Beethoven, really good composers it is. And it just, to me, it makes George in that realm because every note has meaning. He's thought about it. It's there for a reason. Nothing's extraneous. And it all feels like it's telling you a story through feeling.
It's funny because
it's a hard thing to explain.
We talk about music in association with feelings. I mean, I hear it everywhere and I see it everywhere. Music is emotion, feeling. I mean, and how come it's not addressed?
Yeah, composers don't talk about it ever. It's never addressed. And when I ask students, well, what do you want the audience to feel? What do you want the performer? It's usually stunned silence. Oh, I don't know, which to me is a dangerous answer. I said, have you really not thought about what you want people to feel when they hear? Well, you're right. If you're a performer, you talk about feelings all the time. And we also pick pieces according to how they make us feel. Unless it's assigned to us, there are certain cues that you gravitate to, and you're more likely to play that. I realized early on with the publishing that people, in order for music to be programmed, really, you can't convince performers to do something unless you're assigning the thing. They've got to feel it in the music. And I think George thought that way as well.
Right. So instinct.
Maybe because they were performers. Yes.
Going back to instinct. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. So the instinct and the feeling as a performer, as a composer, but also in reaching the audience. Because I know George wanted to reach the audience, but he knew the way to do that was through the performer.
Of course.
That's the key. Yeah.
I mean, it's always been the case, right? It's the
yes, but composers don't realize that. That's the thing. That's the irony is composers don't think this way. It drives me out of my mind because I'm like, well, why are you writing if you're not thinking about this? But they don't think about it because a lot of them have never played an instrument. So they say, oh, well, I like the video game music. I want to write
video game.
Music
yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I mean, video game. Okay, want to talk about video game? We're geeking out these days over Baldur's Gate 3. And the music, I forgot the name, but it's that kind of a Russian, Polish name. Maybe I'm... Anyway, I forgot.
They've gotten better. The people writing for the music now. This has become it's become a real thing. You know?
The music for that game is stunning. I have it on my playlist, and sometimes I play it over and over, especially the beginning because it's so evocative, and it fits the plot so well. And wow, you know, or
I bet these people they've been listening to Crumb. That's the thing is I think some of the people who write for video games now have been listening to John Williams and George Crumb. I mean, it's where it's become more of a thing where people are much more aware. It's not just laying down some random music. They want dramatic music. But someone who's thinking about writing dramatic music does have intent. if it's just someone coming in who's writing notes, like it'll be interesting for you to ask each of the pianists or the composers who write something for you to play, ask them, what is the intent? What do they want people to feel? I mean, it would be interesting to ask them that, because they probably didn't think about it. Be willing to bet that at least half of them don't have an answer.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I pretty much address
Yeah.
that when I talk to them, and say, you have to want something. I remember specifically, I wrote down the way to say that to them. You have to want something, otherwise people will not know. I say that the audience will not know what you want unless you know what you want. And it's
that's the same
a
thing.
bigger
That's it
chance.
exactly. Yeah.
It's a bigger
Yeah.
chance for others to know, or to understand, if you understand, first of all. I mean, it's pretty much that. And the same thing as in performing as well. It's the same idea. If you are aware of everything you do there, then it's chances are much better to to reach out to whoever you're playing.
Yeah, George knew that. That's great. That's completely, you're absolutely right. Which is one of the reasons why George's music actually probably speaks to you too, because George thought that way.
Yeah, and it just sometimes when I hear people, even here around, and no names involved, it's just, oh well, George Crumb, there's other music. I mean, I understand, but it's just, give it a chance. It's sometimes it's dismissed so easily just because it's contemporary music, but there's also very good contemporary music out there. Definitely, there is. There is very good contemporary music.
I think they used George's music in The Exorcist. Is that right? I think Jim Permosh, who used to teach. Yeah, I think he said that Jim Permosh said that they used, I think it was Black Angels in the movie The Exorcist. Whoever the director was found George's music really compelling. But I think it's interesting that they sensed that about George's music to put it in a movie that's a horror movie that's really scary.
It's scary, of course. Of course.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Given
It's
me
been
like
an hour and a half. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry if I took
No,
your
it's
time.
okay. It's interesting. It's also exploring my background. I do so many interviews. For me, it's kind of fascinating because it brings up things. I'm like, oh yeah, the violin piano piece I'm finishing right now, I'm thinking about how this is applicable as I'm trying to carve out titles that capture the feeling of what I'm doing. It's weird, but it's connected to George. It totally is. There's just something he didn't say. He's the teacher who said the least amount in lessons, but I feel like he's the teacher I learned the most from.
Yeah. Interesting. Again, it just makes me think of a perfect piano lesson. Just, okay, you explain as much as you can, but then you have to use your ears and big eyes, big ears, and be there. Just focus. Steal as much as you can. Right. Steal. That's the word.
That's what George said to me one day in a lesson. This was the turning point for me in lessons, and I realized, he said, Jennifer, the only thing that matters is how it sounds in the end. It's not whether you can analyze anything or anything, which was kind of a gift for him to say that, because when you're doing a doctorate, you have to explain everything. We were always taking these doctoral exams. You had to explain why this is Berg, why this is Bach, why this is Mozart, why does Bruckner do this? To have a teacher actually say, in the end, what you write, all that matters is how it sounds. Does it resonate with you? And I thought, wow, that's a totally different approach than what people have been teaching in school. Normally they're like, start with this row or start with this form, pour the music in. And George saying that gave me permission to just let go. I literally thought, I walked out of that lesson and thought, you know what, if that's the case, and that kind of makes sense, I should just write by instinct completely and just follow my ear. And I'd started doing that, and the pieces kind of had a much more organic feel, and things started to flow. And since that very lesson, I have written that way. That's the way I write. People do dissertations on my pieces, and they take them apart and they find all these things. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know that was in there. But it's because George said in the end, and you can apply that to everything, rock and roll, country, rap. In the end, it's the pieces that survive are the ones we find interesting to listen to. So is it interesting? That's the true test of a piece.
Yeah.
So it's George. He didn't say much, but what he said was powerful. It's kind of like some of his pieces too.
Right. I was thinking, it doesn't matter what you do or something. It matters how it sounds. And I was thinking because in Macro 2, he wants the performer to use 2 glass tumblers. And I was talking to Professor Orkis the other day and saying, there's a big risk involved in handling glass
Yeah.
tumblers, not 1 but 2 during the performance. And how about you try squeegees? And actually I try squeegees and it's exactly the same sound. And it's all that matters. And, I was thinking, you know what? I'm going to cheat. I mean, okay, no one's going to arrest me for that. And I'm going to take full responsibility.
Yeah.
And, during a live performance is, what's the point? I'm not
George would be okay
diminishing
with
that. I'm sure that.
Yeah, he would be fine with it. It's the sound. It's the sound that was the only thing that mattered to him. So I mean, he would be fine with that. And I'd be willing to bet the squeegees have gotten better that they've made. So there probably are squeegees that have the right property of how hard they are for you to be able to do that successfully. And George would be the first to advocate doing it. If it works sound wise, go for it.
Yeah, especially since they are easy to handle, and you use them and then you put them whatever so that they don't interfere with what you need to do. But while a glass tumbler, it might migrate. It might migrate at some point. And so
I know.
these kind of things that, and talking to James Freeman last week, he said the same thing, that George Crumb would attend a lot of the rehearsals. And he would say the same thing. At some point, something didn't work. Okay, let's try differently. Let's try. So he would be very permissive if the music would ask in that moment.
Right? Call for it. Yes, exactly. Yeah. That sounds like George.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah. Is there? Do you have any forehand piano pieces? For example.
You know what? I do have a forehand piano piece I just did for the Higdon sisters. I'll send it to you.
That would be great.
I'll send it to you
because we are in the process of trying new rap. So we were thinking like, okay, what to play?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and I think I have a video of it. I don't even have a recording. I have a video. They did it as an encore. They were playing something with the Minnesota Orchestra, and their encore was this forehand piano thing that I did. I took. They were asking me, what was it? They said I gave them a bunch of my pieces. I was trying to squeeze something in for them. And I said, let me see if I can arrange one of these other pieces. So I'll send you the music.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's something that I was thinking earlier and then I forgot to address it, but you were talking about that kind of a explosion and, in the music of George Crumb. It made me think of, so yesterday we're working during the chamber session. I was working with Professor Orkis on Schnittke violin sonata, for the first one. And, we're discussing second movement and a little bit of the fourth movement. And if you look at the page, it's just, what is this? It's a hard music to organize, not just individually, but ensemble-wise. And Professor Orkis was saying, well, he had listened to a couple of recordings because he never played the piece. And said, you know what? I'm not so sure. I was not convinced by it. It just sounded so chaotic. And then I remember, my partner said, well, chaotic is dramatic and everything. It's like, yeah, but I like control chaos. Chaos. I like that. It's. And I think it's the same feeling that I get from Crumb's music. It's control chaos because everything is so well planned and written out.
He said, that's true, because when I did Rapid Fire, when I was writing it, because it's aleatoric and it doesn't have a single bar line in it, and I said, look, I can play this and I can just give him a box notation. He said, don't do it. He said, you've got to. It's an explosive piece that just sounds like the flute player is just going completely berserk for 6 minutes, but everything is meticulously notated. And it was because George said he's right. And now that I look at that, and that piece gets done a lot, it had to be that way. Every note had to be written out. I had to figure out how to notate things that had never been separated, like air pressure versus notes. Normally we look at the notes for flute playing and you can tell what to finger, how to breathe, and how to articulate, but I separated that in this piece. So I've got one line that's running that shows changing air pressure, a different fingering, which is also different than the articulation. But that was George. That's exactly what you just said. That's totally the way George approached. It had to be controlled. You could have the intensity, you could have the chaos, but it works better if it is controlled. It has more intensity. It's a better punch, because otherwise, if you leave it up to the performers, he said, you don't know what you're actually going to get. You probably won't get the intensity you want, and it may be all over the place, and it's not a good idea. I remember him saying, it's not a good idea. Notate it. So it was wise counsel. It really was.
Yeah, I was thinking about, the same thing with Schnittke. I mean, yeah. That kind of writing that requires a lot of precision and thinking how to do it, when to do it. It's just, different style.
Yeah. Well, this has been a pleasure.
Same, thank you.